What's going on, workforce? Brian and Chris here, and today we're actually talking about the Final Fantasy XVI news that happened this week over on Reddit. Somebody took, restart Haramagami?
Harem
Haramagami?
Gami?
Haramagami?
I like to just pick one part. So just hair or Gami, your choice.
Well, let's jump into it. We're just going to roll with it because I was like, all right. Summarized essentially from all the different sources of interviews.
So much for Japanese only. So if you want to go find the source material, just be aware that like with Google Translate, if you haven't gone and done like Japanese interviews for 14 or anything like that, just be well awake at the time because sentence structure doesn't always make the jump.
Also, guys, be sure that if you're interested in our Final Fantasy news coverage, July the 1st, we're going to be covering it over on Twitch and on YouTube for you guys as we learned about 6.2. Just wanted to kind of plug that real quick because also Yoshi-P in charge of Final Fantasy 16 summer 2023. And I know the one thing that I saw on my feed as I've had an incredibly crazy week, I'll probably share a little bit more on that later. I saw that they're already working on an additional trailer and they're like 98% done, but that's probably going to drop this fall. My guess would be TGS or sometime, it's some other video game conference. So I think we're going to see lots of Final Fantasy 16 news building up to the hype. But they state, I'm going to talk about this one because I saw a lot of people frustrated from the first trailer, or I guess technically the second trailer, that they didn't see any party members. And they say party members are going to be there, but they're going to be AI controlled. And so you're going to primarily control Clive. I say primarily, but like that's going to be the key focus. In my mind, I naturally thought that because I felt like they were going with the Witcher vibe. I don't know if that kind of resonates with you, but like when I play Witcher, you are playing one character in that regards. Final Fantasy as a series, though, also known for its party mechanics. Final Fantasy 15 had, pretty much at first you only controlled Noctis, but then later they gave you the ability to swap and control the additional party members.
Do you like running a balanced party, or do you like picking one guy and you're like, this one's
I like the party mechanics, but what I hope for when they talk about the AI control part, I love the Gambit system from Final Fantasy 12. Okay. And yes, you could change your key character that you're controlling in 12, but I also I want that ability to say, listen, you're with me. This is what I want you to focus in on because this is the kind of way I'm going to build Clive out. And I like to have a complementary thing as opposed to where like 15, it really felt like the characters were who they were, but I couldn't really do anything more with them. And I wish I had more control over that because I kind of like that kind of gameplay personally. So,
but to change it up,
some
characters will be playable just for like small segments. Which we already do that in 14. So that's not weird. Especially if like a party splits up, right? One goes left, one goes right. There's important stuff happening in both directions. So obviously you're going to play Clive's direction, but you're also going to get to play the other direction.
I feel that we're going to see a lot of parallels to 14, and we already kind of have in the trailer with the Red Moon, whatever that was, if it means anything at all, or if it's just a little bit of like, let's see if they, let's send them down a rabbit hole. So it also is not going to be open world, which a lot of people, and maybe there was some, because I remember hearing people saying, oh, it's an open world, etc. So it's not going to be open world, but it will feature a lot of areas. 4 large areas are going to be especially huge. And I've seen a lot of disappointment in the Twitter feed about this. A lot of people frustrated because they were hoping for a more open world, meaning you kind of really go where you want, you do what you want, you impact the world in the way you want. But I never thought that was going to be the case because from the outset, it looks like it's a very narrative-driven game, right?
I mean, world size to me only matters with what we can interact with. So we have seen games that make large maps and it's all just barren and there's nothing to do, at which point it actually would make me more frustrated. So like if you want everything to be really meaningful and deep and have all of these options and have these big moments that you're building to, then having a curated environment might really complement that. And so I think rather than saying like, well, I don't like this artist because they only, they don't even consider this different canvas size. How about we let them finish the piece and then decide if that was the right size canvas? The world thing is like, that starts to tell me what to expect. But at the end of the day, let the piece speak for itself.
Yeah. They said the game will actually feature a monster hunt system, side quests, hideouts, and such, which that seems pretty straightforward. I love it when they have like the hunt system for Final Fantasy 12 is where we get some inspiration within Final Fantasy 14. I really liked how they did it in 12, as you're just kind of playing that, but that's obviously a single player game. This is going to kind of echo that. So if they're able to kind of take that system and bring it in, I think it adds a lot of value for those who want to kind of invest in it and go down that rabbit hole overall. So, I mean, I don't think that was a major bullet point, but it's exciting to see that they're going to have plenty of, other content to do outside of just like focusing in on the MSQ.
Sure. And then the story is going to progress into these kind of big and low moments like a roller coaster, right?
Yeah.
So it's all about, it can't just be nonstop hits. You gotta kind of build to it. And then you can explore, take your time, or obviously you'd be able to beeline because we have all that side content they just said right above that.
It's going to be interesting from a content creation perspective, right? When we ever look at like Final Fantasy 14 specifically, and when people come in and how like being late to the party in terms of like playing through the story ends up being beneficial for the content creator because everybody kind of wants to experience it. I know I, for myself, want to experience the story, but then already I'm saying like I really enjoyed that I played through Endwalker live so that I have all that footage and I'm able to I can cut it down if I need to. I can take big moments and make reaction content out of that. Like the content creator brain in me, I think, is a weird warping perspective on the taking your time versus the beeline. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I don't think it's going to be a consumption until after people have played through it. And so, good luck PS5.
For me, if it's content creation, they need to add something, and single player games feel so well-rounded. They often feel like such a five-course meal that like a lot of them don't need anything. And so like I already think that this has to be a creator that is doing something that the game couldn't have seen coming. So I think of people like Sebi Webby and Preach, where like when they go through a game, they are adding something that I didn't know I wanted, as opposed to something like 14, where it's like, no, I actively have a question, and I'm going to go out to Google, and somebody's going to tell me the answer.
Yeah. So in terms of your build, they state that there will be a skill tree, as the poster here understands it, and they're going to have one for each of the icons.
Sure.
And you can actually respec your build if you want, which makes sense as a part of an RPG. I think that's going to be a kind of a key component. Overall,
it's like Outriders was like that, was it not?
Oh yeah, Outriders and then Outriders has their expansion dropping here actually I think this week, which is gonna be exciting. I'm looking forward to jumping back into that.
Okay. And then their themes will be around the clash of values and ideals and the bonds between people, which just feels like a description of Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be a Final Fantasy mainline, guys. A lot of this is going to be like, if Final Fantasy 16, people are seeing the hype and they're not familiar with Final Fantasy, a lot of the things that we see in these interviews are going to be things that some of you are like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But for many people, like I know, like 15 was the first Final Fantasy for a lot of people, and Final Fantasy 14's been the first Final Fantasy for a lot of people, and so, it's good that they're being this general, but I don't know that all of this is like ground shattering.
Mm-hmm. So then they go on to saying that you're going to have friends along the journey and some will fight alongside you, which ties to the first bullet point of AI controlled party members. It sounds like there's going to be a where they come in and they leave. And that's actually something I really appreciated from Final Fantasy IV, is that along the journey, it wasn't like, oh, here's my set party that I'm going to be on this journey with the entire time. Party members would come in and they would leave. And I remember this is obviously me as a young kid, being absolutely surprised. And by the time you actually hit your final party, it was really interesting to see like who was there still with you on this journey. And they've even gone on their own journeys because some characters would leave and come back. And I really appreciated that. And that's actually something where I kind of looked at that story as being like one of the bests that I experienced outside of Six and Tactics.
And you'll be able to give them directions in battle and stuff. But for me, that kind of rotating party is what tells them that narratively they're going to be able to do whatever they want to do. Mm-hmm. And so like they could kill a party member off, or they could make somebody that you thought you were against join you later, or they can have somebody, like you said, go off and have their own adventure and come back and be new and changed. And so I think it frees them up, as opposed to these 5 people are friends at the beginning and now they're going to be friends at the end, and there's not allowed to be any variety through the middle.
This bullet point also talks about having potentially your dog wolf Torgal actually be kind of a party member, or somebody fights alongside you. I think that's a really cool idea. I always like that. I like that from Fable 2, where you had that dog, that bond, that relationship, and they can. Oh man, that's always scary when they're like, and we have a dog mechanic. Oh, and you're gonna love this dog. Like you ever see? It did that in Call of Duty too. I'm like, oh man, they're gonna kill this dog. I'm gonna be so pissed. I'm gonna be so mad about that.
Now, here comes the promise that asks, do you trust Yoshi-P? Because every developer says this. Okay, so this is just a straight up trust bullet point. The game will be complete at launch. You won't need any movies.
Yep.
There will be reading materials in the game if you want to learn more. And he told him that the series was becoming static in their vision, which is why Final Fantasy XVI is going to be different. So being told that something is going to be different and complete are two things that are just straight up a question of trust.
Right. And that's honestly, those are 2 bullet points that actually speak to me as a player, because my critique of 15 was it was so fragmented that if you actually then seek out the whole thing, you're like,
Sure.
This is actually really good. And I think the reason it got fragmented is because when they were like, oh, here's our vision, and then to be able to execute the development of that, they didn't have a cohesive team. And a lot of people talk about how game development's, oh, it's not that much more expensive, and all, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, then yet you look at the entire field, and more games, especially single player games, are more difficult to make, and they take longer to make. And a lot of people don't factor in the human resource cost of things, not in terms of just payment, but in terms of, hey, you're on this team for 3 years, and guess what? You want to go do something else now? Okay,
Right.
Now that expertise is walking out the door, and trying to retain that with bonuses and with the structure, because like 3 years is a long time to work on a single project, but now all of a sudden these games have moved into a 5-year cycle, and that becomes a much bigger risk. That's why you're seeing a lot of that. And so having 16, like him committed to this as a complete product, if he delivers on that, I think that's massive. I think that's exactly what the players want. But if it comes out, then it's like, I have no problem if down the road, at some point in the future, they're like, hey, you guys really bought into that, and so now here's a multiplayer DLC expansion or something. You know,
Sure.
like, hey,
Sure. Monster Hunter does stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it's like, oh my gosh, you guys support this way too much. We cannot keep all this money without giving you more content.
Right.
So it's this back and forth, like,
Yeah.
like no, you hang up,
But
no,
not
you
a-
hang up. Just
yeah.
this love letter to each other.
but not a part of the main design. I think that's
it
where
wasn't core.
15 felt so, because then all of a sudden the story in the world is locked behind the DLC, as opposed to like, hey, you finished the story. Oh, we've actually made a new chapter that wasn't, it's not like you have the full experience, but now if you wanted, hey, we decided to jump ahead 25 years as part of some, you like the world, you want to play in it, now there's this multiplayer. I don't know. Like, I think multiplayer makes the most sense in terms of a paid DLC to kind of be added onto, because then if you want to keep playing in that world, there's a value there. But well, I mean,
I think Yoshi-P has earned us trusting him personally, but that is each individual's.
Oh, yeah.
It's
You look at
somebody's
the-
first Final Fantasy game.
look at the comments on this video, guys, if you want to see a different view of Yoshi-P. And that's growing more and more, especially as Final Fantasy XIV has been, as people start to actually see what we were talking about back in Stormblood, which is, it's just kind of nice to see that, hey, we maybe, like, yeah, y'all like a little bit early on it, but it is what it is. Like, we're just like, this is what's happening. And now more and more people are like, those work to game guys. Like, you had somebody literally like, I never have agreed with you, but now I get it. Now I know what you're talking about, because now I agree with you. You were just talking about, like, in terms of, like, anyway. So we were
It's a
having
life
good time.
cycle, right? And everybody's at a different point in their 2,000 or 3,000 hours in the game. So the Kingdom Hearts team helped develop the combat and boss battles. So I know there's a lot of people that when they run into downtime in 14,
Yeah.
they jump over to Kingdom Hearts. Papa Komi comes to mind, and so that's hopefully that kind of tells you whether or not that combat and boss battle system might have little shadows and elements of something you either like or don't like. And then Clive will fight the icons in his human and icon forms, and seems to hint that we might control more than a freak, which
Yeah,
I think
I
the
feel
trailer
gives that. Yeah.
I would have felt a little oversold if they did, they call out all these names and they're like, and you get to control a freak like one time.
Well, maybe in the sense where, like, you could see how he gets these additional powers, but he transforms into Ifrit, and maybe like his full icon form would just always be that.
It's like an icon against icon battle.
Oh yeah, and then we at the end of the trailer, an Ifrit versus Ifrit battle, which I think essentially is going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the long run. Let's see here. Valastaya, and I'm probably butchering that. We'll work on it. Has a super technological civilization. Alligans, anyone? That collapsed 1,500 years ago. Oh, there it is. Think 14 Alligans and Final Fantasy XII's Ivalice. Ruins will show up. I think that's cool. I feels a little played out sometimes, but it is kind of a true story, because a lot of, like, when you see the height of technical civilizations, one of the things that I saw somebody do a critique of the Hunger Games is that it's not like this is set in the past. Like, the civilization has hit this high point, and then in that you can still see tyranny. You can still see these things that plague us as human beings. And so even in a world where, like, oh yeah, maybe they've solved so many problems, there's still this underlying humanity that can have it all collapse down, and you can regress as a civilization. I think that's a very human story in and of itself. But also, if we're playing in this medieval space, and then you get to step into a dungeon that's really technological and advanced, that I think that's fun. I think you see that contrast. You can see that how that plays out. Could be a lot of fun as well.
So, looking at transforming into icons comes with sacrifices and serious risks. But you can transform back into human, and Clive's going to go through 3 life stages.
Woohoo!
Teenager, 20, and 30. So there's a chance to talk about serious risk reward. There's a chance to have real consequences, to see those things play out over time.
Right, because often more than not, and this is like, I mean, we could talk about like cigarettes as a real world parallel.
So,
like, you're in your teens and your 20s, and I'm not a smoker, but it's like you're smoking, you're like, I'm fine, and then like all of a sudden you jump 20 or 30 years in the future, you're like, that was a bad idea, like, oh
yeah, if there's truly meaningful stuff in here, then it will be something that you made a decision when Clive was a teenager, and then your 20s playthrough may have different
if they
options.
have that in that regard, that
so.
ends up being a lot of fun. Like, oh, you could, like, we saw that happen in Chrono Trigger. You could do one thing or another, and then that end up having these other rippling effects. And in Chrono Trigger, you had different endings, but that's where New Game Plus came in to be strong.
Watching Sebi play through Final Fantasy VII and his knowledge of it, and talking about the different consequences of his decisions and all of that, and incredible. And then of course fully voiced because of Sebi.
Story mode, it will have accessories that slow down time, auto combo, and other various buffs. Cool. Like, I love accessories and how they can change gameplay. I think that could also end up being a way of changing up the difficulty, if that kind of played out. Why don't you take the next one?
Action mode for action fans. And then the game's going to show you how to use it in the UI, so you can still use these different like accessories and there's perks. Nice. And then after you beat the game, they're going to have a hard mode difficulty. So like talking about different play styles being accounted for, and talking about replayability being baked in, are 2 things that I think help the game appeal beyond just it's going to have a good story.
As a content creator, though, that actually gets me excited to where, like, I feel like I could play the game, and yeah, people aren't going to watch the stream because that's just the nature of it. Like, as long as you know what you're stepping into, but by the time people finish it, like, I could then say, hey, I'm gonna live stream the hard mode. I think essentially that can be kind of fun to see, like, how hard is hard, because like, oh, you already know the fights. Is that more mechanically hard, or is that like more stat driven hard? Like, does that really change it? Because I've been enjoying hard mode as a part of the triangle strategy, and that's so much fun because it really has you think through like your moves and who you are willing to sacrifice in order to get the victory on the battlefield.
Score system for beating stages, and then 95% of the second trailer was real time.
Woohoo!
But there will be a photo mode included. So
yeah, that seems pretty standard now. Like, like, hey, why didn't you not launch with a photo mode? I mean, you look at 14's investment in a photo mode. It's a feature I don't use, but it is a feature that seems to be high in demand.
And then it started with 4 people, and they worked on it until they decided on everything, then started full development, which should help. As long as those 4 people can stay intact all the way to see the project through to fruition, that can help something feel really cohesive. Because when somebody else comes in, they don't think the way the person who they took over for thinks. And so even if they're respectful of their vision in the past, that kind of screws over what they do in the future. And if they rework what they did in the past, that kind of throws it in the trash. And so that's really nice. I think that's what made Final Fantasy XIV story so meaningful, is that they've done such a good job retaining and developing the story team in-house. And so you don't have a new writer coming onto the team every single expansion who's never worked on 14 and comes into the space. It feels cohesive.
Yeah. And in the last two notes says that he saw people saying they're not going to even watch 16's trailer because they didn't like Final Fantasy 15. I've seen people say that they're not going to like 16 because they don't like action combat and they want turn-based, of which I would tell them, Bravely Default, I would tell them Octopath Traveler. Like, Square Enix is making those Final Fantasy games, and honestly, I would love to see them make a turn-based Final Fantasy game in the future. And I don't know if it necessarily would need to be in the main line because, things evolve, and I don't want 14 just like to be stuck in its past, held down and not able to grow and attract in new players. And I hope that my kids will be interested in playing through Final Fantasy 20 and, what have you. But I think that's interesting. And I think this comes down to kind of a key aspect. I appreciate the short hype cycle of 16 so much because it is coming out summer 2023. We assume, world changing events, you never know. But like in that vein, the fact that they're not hyping this game up for 10 years. I don't have the energy to give you 10 years of excitement that the game can deliver on. But over the course of the next year, I can absolutely follow the news. Sure. I can absolutely be excited about it. I can absolutely, jump in on day one and play and experience it, assuming I get a PS5 or it also comes to PC. That's a real concern that I have. Imagine if it only launches on PS5 and people still can't get PS5s, and then they're like, PC in 6 months. All right. I hope when they say PC in 6 months, if they do that it's not Epic Store in 6 months. And then if you wanted it on Steam, you got to wait another 6 months because I just picked up 7R. I haven't had a chance to play it yet. This week's been nuts. But 7R, and it runs on Steam Deck. It runs on my PC. I'm going to stream it because I want to. But then someone's like, the game's 2 years old. For me, it's brand new, man. I have not had the capacity to find a way to play this game at the moment. I could have bought a PS4, but I refused to because my other PS4 died. And so I was like, I'm just going to get a PS5. I'm not buying a second PS4. Like, that's just who I am.
And I think the hype cycle is also, like, Yoshi-P's admitting, hey, 1.0 damaged the game.
Yeah.
It damaged the franchise. Final Fantasy 15 damaged the franchise, which is crazy because you hear 15 and 16, you're like, oh, so there's 16 Final Fantasy games?
It's one of the top 3 selling copies of 15.
There's way more than 16 Final Fantasy games.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
So, like, for 2 games to hurt it, it's not the 2 of the more recent entries relative to the history hurt a 16-thing franchise. Like, the non-numbered Final Fantasies, it's a huge, broad and wide franchise. So for an initial expansion that's now been deleted and a game that has sold fairly well, to be defining the franchise, he wants to make something different. He wants to make something amazing, and I think he wants to kind of take some ownership. It has to be incredibly frustrating as the developer of 14 to be told that your game sucks because of something that you weren't involved with.
Yeah. You came in and had this and then you're like, this is the best we can do with the technology and budget we have. And that's why I'm really excited to see where 14 goes from here. And we'll be sure to cover that and talk about that and talk more about 16 updates. We got a couple more videos we're going to film today. So Chris, you got any final thoughts on this one?
No, I am doing the last of 2.x, 2.5, and Binding Coils will be coming up on stream, I think, the next lore week. So keep an eye on that if you want to come talking about playing old content. If you've made it this far and you're like, 2 years is not old, Brian. Yeah. If you want to see some old content, it's new to me.
New to you.
New to me.
All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed our thoughts on the 16 bullet points of the interviews that have all happened this week. Let us know your thoughts below. Like, favorite, subscribe, and share if you haven't already and you feel like we earn it. But until next time, guys,
take care.